Okay, now it's 7 sharp, and we have the pleasure to invite Professor Daniel Gile, Professor Emeritus at Université Sorbonne, Nouvelle. I hope my pronunciation is okay. Thank you very much for joining us today. And Professor Gile has a training, the initial training as a mathematician. And he has a PhD in Japanese and a PhD in linguistics at the same time. He has been a conference interpreter working for REEC for over, actually REEC conference interpreter for over 3 decades. Many of us have known his work, basic concepts and models for translator and interpreter training. I still recall the days when I was an MA student. This is like a Bible for all of the interpreting students. We read it page by page and memorize a lot of things, including the effort models introduced in the book. Another highlight of Professor Gile's work is the Syrian network, the newsletter that he has been kept on publishing since 1990. Almost actually now is the 1/4 of a quarter of a century of a history of a newsletter, which has been again read widely by a lot of researchers in the field of interpreting and benefited a lot from the introduction of works on conference interpreting and other types of interpreting. I remember other types of interpreting also included in the newsletter as well. So we really welcome him here. And also today we have a special feature of the session. As you can see, standing next to me is Jessica, our sign language interpreter. And we have the honor of sign language interpreting sponsored by Brentford for tonight's event. So we hope that you will enjoy Professor Gile's talk alongside with the deaf community, and they will definitely benefit the talk as well. Thank you very much. Now the floor is yours.
Okay, so let us start with conference interpreting. I talk about conference interpreting. What am I referring to? I am referring to something that is a bit wider than the initial historical definition. In the beginning, conference interpreting as a profession was defined as taking place in settings of international conferences, initially intergovernmental conferences, and then it extended into many other settings, including scientific and technological meetings, lectures, press conferences, interpreting on TV, negotiations, even high-level court hearings. So here, when I talk about conference interpreting, I define conference interpreters in 2 ways. First of all, by their function, and I think those of you who are into sign language interpreting will immediately see the difference. The function of the conference interpreter is to be, in a way, to produce the target language version of the speaker with no cultural mediation, no further explanation, generally no intervention. This is the theoretical role. And the second thing by which I will define conference interpreting is the requirement in terms of performance quality. First of all, conference interpreters are required to provide very high accuracy in terms of information. And secondly, they need to have a high level of linguistic quality. This is what they're required to do. There are other features such as professional conduct, but these are not relevant to this talk because this talk is about cognitive challenges. Now, I said cognitive, but what do I mean by cognitive? This has become a very fashionable word, and it is a bit difficult to define in very precise terms. It would take a long time. So let me help you understand what I mean in a very intuitive way. Please multiply 32 plus 60, multiply 32 by 66. You have 1 second. Well, do you have the solution? Maybe there are a couple of geniuses here who do. But even those who use a calculator will not be able to do it in 1 second. So you know the numbers. You know what a multiplication is. You know how to do the multiplication. But performing the action requires some complex operations in the brain. This is what I mean by cognitive. This is what I will be referring to as cognitive. Nowadays, cognitive scientists have much wider definition of cognitive, but for our purposes, let us just use this definition. What do conference interpreters actually do? What do we see on the surface? What do we hear when we look at them, when we listen to them? They listen to a speech or read a speech made in one language. They produce a speech in another language, just as my colleague here is doing. Listening in one language, producing in another language. In simultaneous, they listen and speak at the same time, which is what's happening here. And when people look at simultaneous interpreters, they say, oh, how do they do it? It must be very difficult. Do they have a special talent? Do they have special techniques? I have not heard people doing this when people do sign language interpreting, probably because they don't realize that in sign language interpreting, it's exactly the same work, but much more difficult. But when they listen to spoken language conference interpreters, they wonder, how do they do it? In consecutive interpreting, people listen, then take notes, then reproduce the speech. And what onlookers are impressed by is the fact that they can interpret speeches of 5, 10, 15 minutes. And people think, oh, what a wonderful memory. Or they must have a special technique for note-taking. This is the only way you can do it. So what talent exactly is required, we don't know, in spite of much speculation. It is being investigated. Maybe there is a certain type of bilingualism. Maybe there are certain cognitive aptitudes. The brain knows how to do certain things in a certain way, efficiently and fast. Maybe, we don't know yet. Cognitive psychology has been investigating that for a long time, and now it's quite exciting to see that with brain anatomy and the activity, electric and chemical activity in the brain are being explored as well. And maybe we'll know more in the near future about what really happens. Techniques for interpreting are taught in training programs. How to prepare assignments, how to take notes in consecutive, how to deal with various situations. What we'll be looking at here are the challenges, cognitive challenges. When I started doing conference interpreting, I was taught at ESIT in Paris that interpreting involves comprehension of the source speech, what they called deverbalization, a strange word. What they meant was that you completely forget the structure of the source language. You just have something that is deverbalized, a mental representation of the content, and then you reformulate on that basis. And the idea was that if the languages, the working languages, were fully mastered, then comprehension and reformulation were completely spontaneous, completely effortless. And that the process was completely the same, no matter what the languages were, and that it was not true that working from one language A into one language B is easier or more difficult than from one language A to language C, etc., etc. Now, your interpreter at this point is investigating this in research and trying to see whether it is true or whether there are differences. Anyway, if languages are fully mastered, if the interpreter has sufficient background knowledge, and if the speaker does not speak too rapidly or doesn't read a text which is too dense, etc., then conference interpreters who are qualified should be able to render the speech flawlessly. Perfect accuracy, 100%, excellent language quality. That's the ideal. And when I say cognitive challenges, what I say is that actually it's not as easy as that. And even qualified interpreters or interpreters who have the reputation of being highly qualified do not produce flawless renditions in terms of accuracy and in terms of language quality. As regards language quality, if you actually look at what interpreters produce and investigate these on corpora or in experimental research, or even observing interpreters, you will find that there are many infelicities. Infelicity means things that are clumsy, not grammatical errors, not lexical errors, but things that are not quite right. Very often there are sentence constructions that are unnatural. This has been investigated, and in particular in China, with so-called dependency distance parameters. Dependency distance tends to shrink in the output of interpreters. Unnatural prosody. Prosody is the music of the sentence, is the music of the speech. And sometimes when you hear conference interpreters, very often you realize that they do not speak as they would in everyday life. It's different. It's a sort of interpretese. Sometimes there are problems with pronunciation, with the lengthening of syllables. All of these are facts. And all of these have been investigated empirically. So we know they exist. What about informational accuracy? There are frequent errors and omission. When I say frequent, that means there could be many of them during a turn in the booth. When an interpreter works for 30 minutes, in these 30 minutes, they could be 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 errors or omissions, or both. Again, this is something that you find out whenever you do research. This is not something that we professionals like to talk about. We're not going to tell our clients that we make errors. Some of them realize it, but some of them don't. We say we try to be the speaker. Plus, besides what you can actually observe, what about the feeling? What about the perception by interpreters? Sometimes the interpreters feel that something that the speaker actually said was not heard by them. Does that happen to you, those interpreters among you? It happens to students in class. There's a speaker, then one student is asked to interpret the speech, and when that student interprets the speech, somebody else in the class said, "Oh, I didn't hear it." How come? Did you close your ears? Did you plug your ears for a fraction of a second? No, you did hear it. But the brain did not process it, cognitive. Sometimes you hear and understand something, but by the time you are ready to reformulate it, it got lost somewhere, maybe in a traffic jam, going to Kowloon, going to Hong Kong Island. And sometimes what we see is that a very difficult passage in a speech is translated correctly, but for some strange reason, something that comes before or afterwards is not, like yes or no, or like 100. How could this be explained? Okay, so these are things that you observe. There's no need to be a big scientist in order to observe this and even measure this, to measure the frequency and to categorize errors, omissions, etc. Language quality in the output, if you don't see anything, it doesn't mean that there's no data. It's just disappeared. The data was stolen. There's probably a technical problem with the, but what I have here is data from an experiment with students that I conducted in the 1970s at ISIT. This is my university, with students working in simultaneous, in consecutive, and when making presentations. And you could see that the number of errors and infelicities rose sharply when you move from spontaneous presentations to consecutive to simultaneous. But even in spontaneous speech, there were problems. I need to develop a new model to account for what's happening here. Okay, these are just five students, all of them working into French, their native language, and this is just a case study. It doesn't prove anything, it's just an illustration. Now, if you look at the data and you know a bit about interpreters, especially if you're an interpreter yourself, you can introspect and realize that these weaknesses and the flaws in the output cannot necessarily be attributed to a lack of knowledge, to a lack of linguistic knowledge or world knowledge. Some kind of mechanism, cognitive mechanism, is not strong enough. So when I started doing research on that topic, I just intuitively thought maybe there is some kind of mental resource, some kind of mental energy that was necessary and that was found lacking. So I started by structuring conceptually simultaneous interpreting as a set of functional operations. What I mean by functional operations, it doesn't mean distinct cognitive tasks. Cognitive tasks are at a very, very detailed level. These are groups of tasks. Everything that has to do with listening, everything that has to do with speaking, and everything that has to do with keeping information in memory for a short time. And the idea was that they were all competing for something that I eventually called processing capacity or attentional resources, it's the same thing, which was in limited supply. I found later, when exploring the literature in cognitive psychology, that this indeed was also an idea that cognitive scientists had and still have. And the requirement was for interpreting to function, to operate well, that the total amount or the total required processing capacity should not be less than what was available, than what the interpreter had. But at that stage, this was just observation, introspection, and reflection. One of the PhD students that I talked to this afternoon talked about observing, and trying to find what he could do and what kind of phenomenon he could investigate. This is about the same kind of process. And generally, science starts with observation. So I started exploring the literature in cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics, and I found classifications of cognitive operations as automatic or controlled. Those that are automatic are extremely fast. You don't think about them, you don't control them, and many of them can be implemented at the same time. Controlled operations need some attention. And as soon as you have more than one, they compete over resources. Another thing which was good news was that controlled operations gradually become automated. That doesn't mean that they become fully automatic, but that means that they require less and less processing capacity. Then I discovered that cognitive psychologists talked about various so-called executive functions or management functions, because when you have more than one task that is being conducted, you need to direct your resources, and therefore there are all sorts of what you might call managerial functions to perform, and I call this the coordination effort. So when I was taught interpreting, the teachers and the head of the program rejected completely cognitive psychology and linguistics. But when you look at things more in depth, more closely, you realize that there's a lot to learn from them, which is what I found. Okay, so I said that the conditions for a successful simultaneous is, first of all, that you have sufficient available resources, but also management is such that you should be able to direct your resources to one effort or the other at the right time. If you have enough attention, but you are focusing on producing, for instance, you were trying to express a particular idea in sign language, and we're trying to think, oh, how am I going to do this? There is no standard sign. I will create something in my signing space, and I will do this and I will do that. By that time, when you do that, you don't have enough processing capacity to listen to the speaker who continues. So the question is, how do you manage your processing capacity? You have to make sure that at each time, you have enough processing capacity for each effort. Again, all of this is pretty intuitive. If at least one of these conditions is not met, either you don't have enough processing capacity overall, or you have enough, but you did not manage it properly, then what can happen is that one of the functions, speaking or listening or short-term memory operations, suffers. So you feel, oh, I haven't heard. Yes, you have heard. The impact of such problems is not necessarily visible on each segment because there are various effects that are delayed, which I explain in some publications. I will not bother you with that, but quite a lot of things can be explained in that way. And why is it of any interest to us to talk about these conditions? Because my assumption, my hypothesis, that I call the tightrope hypothesis, is that we tend to we went to work very close to cognitive saturation. In other words, the total amount of processing capacity that is required when interpreting is sufficiently close to the maximum that either we can give or that we are willing to give, and here is when motivation comes in, is very close to the maximum. So whenever there is a problem, a little problem, there's a flaw in the output. And this is how I tried to explain most of the so-called problem triggers, most of the types of difficulties that are very well known to interpreters as causing problems. And it works quite well. And one thing that is quite important that I didn't mention when I first formulated the tightrope hypothesis is that when I talk about saturation, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are not capable of doing things, but they are capable of doing things at the cost of much, much effort. Now, how much effort are you willing to devote to the task? If you are a sign language interpreter and you see that people who work at a conference for hearing people do not care about the one or two deaf people who are in the audience very much and do not make sure that you have the right place and the right lighting and that the deaf people are seated, then as a sign language interpreter, you may see, okay, these people don't respect us, then maybe I will try to do my best, but I will not do as much as I could if I felt that people really respected us and did their best for us. So there's something called engagement and disengagement in psychology. And this is very important that I didn't factor it in the beginning, and I just started recently to include it in the models. And I think it's very important in training, when training interpreters, when training students, because students encounter difficulties. And sometimes they find that the difficulties are so, how should I say, they're so depressing that they stop trying. But if you manage to motivate them through all sorts of means, including encouragement, paying attention to them, then they will be able to invest more effort, not to give up right away, but only to give up when things get very, very, very hard. And the more they invest, the more we can expect them to acquire skills. So I think it was a mistake on my part not to integrate this into the discussion of tightrope hypothesis, and I'm trying to remedy that now. Now, why should there be a tightrope hypothesis? People would say, wait a minute, everybody speaks. Do you have any problem? Are you close to saturation when you try to speak? When you listen to your friends, to your neighbors, to a salesperson somewhere? Well, why should there be a difference between interpreting and everyday language exchanges? I think there are many explanations, but two that come to one's mind immediately are, first of all, when you do interpreting, you do at least two simultaneous operations at the same time. Research has shown that contrary to what psychologists thought in the beginning, when you do simultaneous, you do not switch from comprehension to production to comprehension to production. When this was measured, they found that at least 50 to 70% of the time, there was really simultaneous speaking and listening. I think the first researcher who measured this was Gile in Russia. And it was replicated, in other words, it was found again by Ivana Chenkova. That's a Czech colleague when we get back, she'll hit me on the head because I didn't mention these names before. Sorry. Another thing that is very important that people don't think about is that in interpreting, you need to produce speech with very specific information, not more, not less. Specific register, a speed. You are not free to speak at your own rate. You have to speak at a speed which is imposed by the speaker. So if you need more time to find a word, to understand a word or a clause, you cannot. In everyday life, you can. And you have to do it right the first time. There can be no exchange. Oh, was this right? Was this not right? Like including in sign language, where you say, oh, I don't understand the way you signed, what do you mean? And then there is clarification. When you have a conference setting, when you have a monologue, a speaker, then you just have to get it the first time. And there is a need to fight interference. Interference is when structures and words from one language come to your mind instead of those of the right language. Now, I think the theory was that between sign language and spoken languages, there is no interference because the modalities are different. That's what I heard from colleagues a few years ago, or maybe 10 or 20 years ago. But actually, it's not true because there is evidence, for instance, from South Africa, when working on news from English into African sign languages, that from time to time, the sign language interpreters use words in English. So there is interference. So all these conditions are not usual in everyday verbal exchanges. Okay, so these are the reasons that I assume explain why we work so close to cognitive saturation. And then I started to see whether this could work for other types of interpreting. For instance, consecutive interpreting with notes, it does work. What happens is that in consecutive interpreting, while you listen, you take notes. In simultaneous, while you listen, you speak. So even though you don't have to take notes of absolutely everything that you hear, when you do take notes, you write. And the manual movements are far slower than speaking. So you're behind, and you're behind. This saturates what is called working memory. I will talk about that a bit later. So there is a strong cognitive pressure during this comprehension phase while people are listening. The comprehension phase, I believe, is the source of most cognitive challenges. So it's very important to take the notes correct. And this is why, even though the theory was that simultaneous interpreting is just accelerated consecutive, I do not agree. Neither in cognitive terms, nor in neural terms, nor in practical terms. We can go into that later if you have questions. Another thing is sight translation, which many Chinese colleagues call sight interpreting. I don't like to call it sight interpreting because it is from written, from text. Interpreting is from sign to sign or sign to spoken language, spoken. In sight translation, you have reading and you have production. But if you read, you need some time, fractions of a second, to store the information so that you can understand the full sentence or the full clause so that you can decide how you're going to reformulate it, plus again, coordination. So at first sight, people would think that sight translation is easier than simultaneous or consecutive. You don't forget things and you have them before your eyes. But it is particularly difficult to produce speech in sight translation because you see the text all the time. So you would tend to have more availability of the source text than of the target speech. I will explain that in the second part of this talk. So on balance, it seems to be just as difficult to do sight translation as to do consecutive and simultaneous, at least for beginners. Then there is simultaneous with text. What happens in simultaneous with text? It's the same thing as simultaneous, plus you have a text that you can read. So it's not just like sight translation, because when there is simultaneous with text, the rhythm, the speed is imposed by the speaker. And also you have to read and listen. And very often the speaker will not say exactly what is in the text that you have. So you have more effort, you have more requirements for coordination, plus an additional. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not, depending. Explaining problems. How does this explain the problems that are well known to all of us? Well, when do we have a high risk of failing to produce flawless performance? When requirements for processing capacity increase. When do they increase? When there is high speech density, in other words, much information per unit time. When there is noise, all sorts of noise, including noise which comes from lighting suddenly, which makes it difficult to see the interpreter or to see the signer. Signal distortion, unusual accent. How about unusual signing? Or signing that you're not used to. Unusual prosody, when somebody doesn't speak his or her native language and speaks in a strange way, so you cannot use the information you already have about language in your long-term memory. And when there is overload of short-term memory. In other words, when you have to change the order of information pieces that come in the source language and in the target language. In other words, when the syntactic structure of the two languages is not parallel, is not similar. So this is one case. Another case is when you do not manage your attention correctly. You pay too much attention or too little attention to one of the efforts, production or speaking or listening. If your lag behind the speaker is too short or too long, one of the pioneers in research into sign language interpreting by the name of Stockow actually conducted research on the time lag in sign language interpreting and found a correlation between the length of the lag and the number of errors in a certain way. There are other cases where attention is not managed optimally, and then there are vulnerable segments, vulnerable speech segments. I always wonder about Chinese, because if you have a Western word with 5 syllables or 6 syllables, suppose you have your attention falters for 1 second. You do not pay attention, or for 1/10 of a second, you may lose one syllable, but still be able to reconstruct. But if you have a word in Chinese with just two syllables, and your attention fails to be at high level, at high intensity, for just a fraction of a second, then you may lose the information and not be able to reconstruct it. Now, you may be able to reconstruct it with a context. You may be, you often are, but sometimes you're not. And in Chinese, you don't have enough grammatical agreement markers that would help you see whether it's singular, plural, the future, the past, etc. So we are more vulnerable. What about numbers? 1. How long did it take me to say 1? 2. Now, if at that time you were doing something else or you were not paying attention, then you may have missed it. And homophones. Of course, there are many homophones in Chinese. There are many homophones in Japanese. These are just a few examples. So when interpreters talk about problem triggers, about what causes them to have problems, to feel stressed, to feel it's getting difficult, then very often with these models, with this way of looking at things, we can provide explanations that seem rational enough. Now, here's one for you. For those of us who are not familiar with sign language interpreting, what do sign language interpreters do? They listen or read. For instance, when they talk, when they interpret into sign language. So they have to listen to the speaker. They have to produce in sign language. They need to have a certain lag. But they also need to manage their position in space. What if I start moving around and showing the blackboard? Maybe the interpreter will have to move around so that she sees the blackboard or the whiteboard. But at the same time, she has to be careful so that the deaf users of her services can see her. So this also takes some conscious attention. When they interpret on TV, they have to be careful in the way they sign because they cannot make big gestures because this is very limited. There are all sorts of things like that. Something else that is quite interesting for us is that when you interpret into sign language, you look at your deaf users. Now, I don't see much signing going on between users here, between deaf users in this room, but very often you do. And very often they talk to each other, and very often they talk to the interpreter, saying, for instance, I have not understood, please ask the speaker to explain again, or saying, no, this is not the right sign, there's another sign, things like that. This is something that we don't do in spoken language interpreting, but it's quite an effort, especially if you have a room with lots of people and you have 2 or 3 or 4 people signing to each other and sometimes signing to somebody else in another row or signing to the interpreter. We have to think about that. This is one of the reasons why I have a lot of admiration for sign language interpreters who manage to do all that. In production, when you produce sign language, and I speak under the control of deaf people and of sign language interpreters. So if I'm wrong, this is exactly the time to tell me, no, what the speaker is saying is completely wrong. There is a component, cognitive component of memory that comes in, because every time you use the space in front of you and you put things, people, objects somewhere above, below, on the right, on the left, etc., and then you refer to them later, you have to remember who did you put where. So in cognitive terms, this could be part of the memory effort. But in functional terms, it's different. In functional terms, I think this is part of the production effort. But you have to remember that. You have to have this visual spatial memory, which we don't need to do. And there's another thing, lexical gaps. Lexical gaps is the case. There are lexical gaps between any two languages. They are words or signs that exist in one language, not in another. So what happens if you have a word that exists, say, in English, but it doesn't exist in your sign language? This would be a gap. By the way, a lexical gap could exist the other way around. A sign that exists in your sign language, but that doesn't exist in a spoken language. The problem is that because of the structure of sign language, when there's lexical gap, when interpreting into sign language, you sometimes have to be very creative, very, very creative in thinking how you're going to explain this, as if a spatial paraphrase with entities and movements and many people coming to see one person who will do this and that, and oh, this is a doctor. Oh, this is a garage mechanic, etc., because the sign may not exist. What happens? It takes a lot of time. And it takes some cognitive effort, some processing capacity to come up with this way of creatively expressing something that would be far easier when you do spoken language interpreting, because there's one word and another word that corresponds to it more easily. By the way, all of this was done thanks to my PhD student, former PhD student, who is a sign language interpreter. You see her name in black, Sophie Pointurier-Pournin. She completed her PhD in 2014, and she's now head of the sign language interpreting section at ISI. So I didn't invent this. This is her work, and we developed this model together. Now, another thing that happens, and that is a bit, which is a bit difficult for spoken language interpreters to understand, or for people to understand, is that sometimes you work in teams with one hearing interpreter and one deaf interpreter, because the hearing interpreter knows sign language, but maybe the deaf interpreter knows how to sign in a way which is clearer and more convincing to deaf people, because there is less interference, it's more natural. So they have to work together. And in order for this to work well, they have to communicate. So can you imagine all the efforts that go into this? They have to communicate, to encourage each other, to regulate each other so that they can come up with the best solution. Again, it was an MA thesis which suggested this effort by someone called Fonvieille. That's quite recent, and I think I have to give credit to him for this very interesting MA thesis. Not that you find some very interesting research work which is done not only at PhD level and above, but MA thesis can be quite interesting as well. Okay, so far we have looked at things in an overall way, not very technical. Now, if we look at things a bit more technically, since we are dealing with languages, generally when we talk about languages and language learning, I'm not talking about experts in language acquisition. I'm talking about people in everyday life. They think either you know a rule or a word or a character, or you don't. It's binary, 0 or 1. But for us, that's not enough. And we know that. We know that sometimes you look for a word, but can't find it. Tip of the tongue. right? What about something else? Sometimes you understand a foreign language when you read it, but when somebody speaks it, you don't understand. Or you understand when it's spoken very slowly, but not when it's fast. How come? Again, a cognitive challenge that is linked to what we discussed earlier. So I call language availability the relative difficulty and the time it takes to find a word, or not just a word, or a rule of grammar, etc., and use it, or understand a sound, or understand a sign. If availability is low, meaning that it takes you some time to find the word that you're looking for. Let's say something that will probably be very familiar to you. If you use a lot of computers and iPhones and all that, how often do you actually write in Chinese characters manually? Okay, so do you find that sometimes a character that you learned in school doesn't come immediately? That's what I mean. This is low availability. Now, if there is low availability, that means low availability in daily conversation is not a big problem. You say, oh, what was the word? And then you find it or go around it. But in simultaneous, you cannot do that. If speech production is too slow, you need to store information in memory, what is called working memory. I will be saying more about that. And it is saturated. In comprehension, it's even worse. If your comprehension, if your ability to make sense out of the set of signs that you see or the sounds that you hear is too slow, if your ability does not allow you to go very fast, then what happens is that actually you don't understand at all. It's not that you understand more slowly, but you don't understand at all. Let's say the speaker is above. Let's say there are words or there are signs. You have a listener with high availability. There will always be a little lag of a fraction of a second, but the listener will keep up. But if the listener has low comprehension availability, then they lag behind, and the storage capacity of memory, of so-called working memory, which I'll be talking about a bit later, is not enough, and it is saturated. When we look at the language, that the words, the signs, the rules of grammar, the characters, everything that we know in any language, some of them are highly available, some of them are less available, some of them are almost not available. You can represent this graphically with a sort of model, like the model of the atom. I call it gravitational. Sounds a bit pompous, but that's just because of the way it reminds us of the planets or the atom and the electrons, etc. When we use a language, the words or all these language units become more and more available. We use them repeatedly, they become available. What happens in the brain, we believe, is that they establish links. There are links that are established that link them to sounds, maybe to meaning, maybe to other words. The links are strengthened, and there is more access to them, and they become more available. When you do not use them, they drift outwards. Now, I talked to a couple of you today who studied Japanese, for instance, who were fluent in Japanese, and a few years later, they are no longer fluent in Japanese. This is the drift, the drift. Also, when one word or one piece of linguistic knowledge becomes more available, others are becoming more available as well. What I call the escort effect, probably because they're linked to networks of neurons in a sort of high efficiency network of connections between them. And also there is interference. Interference, if something becomes available in one language, and maybe you're looking at another language, maybe what is more available is the version in the wrong language, not in the one that you're seeking. So these are things that that happen and that you have to look at and fight or use. The availability, language availability in any language for anyone varies from moment to moment. So whenever you measure the availability, you measure the availability at one point in time, and it will move. And also, it is different for production and comprehension. You do not necessarily, sometimes you have something that is available for production, not available for comprehension, and it's not the same for written and spoken. So the whole model here is really something extremely simplistic, but it shows the basic dynamics that I believe, again, tell us things, tell us what's happening, and tell us what to do when we are training and when we're trying to improve our efficiency. But I cannot make any quantitative claims. I don't know how to measure whether it's fast or not, all this movement. And I'm waiting for research, perhaps for brain imaging to tell us more about it. Maybe they will tell us whether we can see when a certain word is triggered, when understanding is triggered, and then design plans that will, or experimental designs that will make it possible for us to actually isolate the various mechanisms and interpreting. Another thing that came up recently is that ideally we thought that we should understand, forget the source language, and then reformulate in the target language without actually using the source language. But in cognitive terms, when there are equivalent terms that come up very often, it would make sense to also deal with equivalent terms. I think every interpreter should know that, even if ideologically we say, no, we don't work that way. So actually, we probably have trans-linguistic equivalences that can also be mapped in a gravitational model. And if we have worked often enough in a particular pair of languages, in particular fields, say in the medical field, in banking, in insurance, in computers, etc., probably as soon as we have a certain technical term in one language, then it triggers a response with a term in the other language. So we have to be careful so that there's no interference, but it's definitely useful. So what happens to students as they gradually make their way up to become competent interpreters? People would say experts, but I don't like the word experts because experts in cognitive psychology has a very specific meaning. I would say that the fundamental cognitive challenge in interpreting, as we have discussed so far, is insufficient processing capacity. That's the main cognitive challenge. So what is processing capacity? The processing capacity is the ability to perform cognitive operations with the available resources. This is linked to working memory. Working memory is a psychological construct. It's not something real. It's something that psychologists have thought of as a sort of model to explain lots of things. It refers to temporary storage and processing of information. Like when somebody gives you a phone number, before you can write it down, you rehearse it. You keep it in short-term memory. Once it's written down, you no longer need it. I use the metaphor of a desk. This is my desk here. And you see my wife looking at my desk and saying, oh no, what a mess. How much room is there on a desk? Very limited. So this is working memory. People think that psychologists since the 1950s think that working memory storage capacity is just a handful of maybe, they used to say 7 plus or minus 2, but now people think perhaps 3 or 4 plus or minus 2 chunks of information, a maximum. And what happens afterwards? Nothing happens. If your disk is full of information, which you need to process, and new information comes in from the speaker, either you say, sorry, busy, and this is where you forget, and this is when you think you have not heard, or you say, okay, come in, but then you have to throw away from the desk, something that was on it before you finished processing. This is long-term memory. Long-term memory has a lot of capacity. This is what we call memory in everyday life. So we have lots of books, lots of information, and we can always add. Long-term memory has a large information storage capacity, and the storage requires virtually no processing capacity. Working memory has a very small storage capacity, and its operation requires processing capacity. See, the desk with a computer as a metaphor for processing and as a metaphor for something that would need electricity, so it needs processing capacity. So when we produce speech, what we have is some information that we want to verbalize. So we load this information into working memory. We put it on the desk. So working memory is in charge. Then we go to the library, to long-term memory, to search for words and rules of assembly, grammatical rules, stylistic rules, cultural rules, etc. This takes time, and this takes processing capacity. Then we assemble them once we have found the right ones. We assemble them, and that takes, where is that done? In working memory. This is where the processing is done. When the assembly is completed, we send it to the voicing organs or to the body for signing, head, bust, etc., etc. So time and processing capacity are required for transfers between working memory and long-term memory, for assembly in working memory. Again, this is highly simplified. And language availability has a negative relationship. It's inversely proportional, to simplify it very much, to time and processing capacity required for transfers. What happens in speech comprehension? In speech comprehension, you perceive sounds and or images, an image here, and then this information goes to working memory. Working memory says, aha, what can I find in long-term memory that is useful to understand that, and process it. Again, it takes time and it takes processing capacity. Then working memory compares what it has found in the library, in long-term memory. Oh, this must be that sign. No, this is another sign. It means something else. Or, okay, I know this person who is signing came from this or that part of China. I know they sign differently, so this means that it's this and this and that. Working memory. Working memory compares the information it has from long-term memory and what seems compatible, accepts and rejects candidates, and perhaps looks for another one. When the language units are identified, then you look at the assembly and try to see what this means. Again, time and processing capacity are involved. What determines availability? I would say, and again, I speculate, it's from material that I have read, but it's not rigorous enough yet. I seek confirmation. I think that the availability of production depends on how much information you have already stored. For instance, if you interpret from Chinese and you have all sorts of speakers from many parts of China, you would have better availability when you already have information about how certain words are pronounced, or certain sentences or certain ideas are expressed in various parts in China, than if you only have very standard, less information. It also depends probably on how long-term memory is organized. If you think as a metaphor of how you organize your library, if there are documents that you consult very often, you would tend to put them in a place which is very easy to access. And if there are documents like books or something else that you use very rarely, then what you might do is perhaps put them in the back. So it would take you longer to find them afterwards. Does it make sense to you? Perhaps something like that happens in long-term memory, in the brain, automatically. There are networks that are organized in such a way that information becomes more easily accessible. And of course, it also depends on the function, on how well working memory functions. And this is something that is partly given, perhaps, and it's, to some extent, it is developed by training. I don't know to what extent. This is, again, something that researchers are looking into. Working memory operation between beginners, advanced students, professionals, etc. Comprehension availability depends, again, on how much linguistic information is in long-term memory, how long-term memory is organized, and on processing speed. So it's quite similar. Now, in the brain, there's a huge number of neurons. And knowledge, information, is coded as links between neurons, actually very large networks of neurons. So as knowledge increases, there are new connections that are formed between neurons and also between new knowledge and old knowledge. So there is an association with a network that becomes dense with many, many connections, which presumably gives you better access to information than if you only have a network which is less dense and with less connections. For instance, a name can be accessed by the sound of the name or part of the name. Sometimes you don't remember the name, but you remember it's one syllable, two syllables. You know one of the sounds that are part of it. Spelling features, the memory of when it was learned, etc., etc. All this information comes together in a network. What happens over time if you practice? If you practice, your long-term memory becomes richer. Lexical units, phraseological units, that is clauses, sentences, etc., formulaic language with different phonological forms, because you heard many people with different voices, different accents, different prosodies pronounce the same thing, then your long-term memory becomes richer. There are trans-linguistic correspondences that also come into the network, and there are extra-linguistic information elements that come in as you learn about the world. This increases processing capacity, I believe. One of the concepts that psychologists talk about is schemata. In other words, you have patterns of behavior or patterns of things that happen together. And when you recognize something like that, it makes it possible not to have very small chunks of information, but the patterns that you recognize are far larger and you can treat them as chunks. That means this increases processing capacity. There's a cognitive psychologist called Nelson Cohen, I don't know how to pronounce his name. He talks about focus of attention, which is very close to a working memory. He talks about 3 to 4 chunks, but he also refers to schemata, which makes it possible to have chunks, each of which represents a lot of knowledge, as opposed to a single bit of knowledge. When this happens, there is a lower probability of saturation of working memory. The speaker's flow of words, this is similar to what we saw earlier. So the speaker says something. If the interpreter produces the output at about the same speed, he's always just a bit behind. Sometimes he or she anticipates, but there's no problem with working memory. If the interpreter is too slow, then again, working memory is saturated. So the whole thing could also be analyzed as problems with working memory. So there are many angles to look at these cognitive challenges. So speaking of training interpreters or training students to become interpreters, how do you improve both knowledge that will be used for processing and processing capacity? One way is through knowledge acquisition. So you learn a lot, you read a lot, you try to acquire all of this, which will make it possible for you to establish neural networks that represent the information with very dense links between the various elements. So get interested in the world around you. What people tell conference interpreting students is that they need to get interested in the world around them, especially in those sectors, in those activities that will be most relevant for the market. For instance, if you are trained in Venezuela, then it is recommended to learn a lot about the oil industry because much of the work will be done in the oil industry. And of course, depending on the country, depending on the market, they will ask you to do all sorts of. When you listen, when you read, do it analytically, trying not just to get information, but to see how the information is linked to other information. When you do that, this helps, presumably, constructing the so-called semantic networks that will link pieces of information to each other. So newspapers, internet radio, international TV, etc. I particularly insist on internet radio, where people listen, where people just talk, because if you see the images, you may understand without actually understanding the words. So it's better to focus on the words themselves, on the sounds themselves, so that you improve the efficiency of memory, of long-term memory and of working memory to actually analyze the sound that you hear. Language skills acquisition, listening a lot. If you remember the gravitational model, listen a lot, not just a bit. And I would say listening is better than reading, because when you listen, you get the information straight as it sounds. If you read, you get the visual part. And we know of many people, we had all these French students who studied Japanese, who could read very well, but who couldn't understand spoken Japanese. Not the same thing. Repeated listening until you understand everything, and actually note, observe features of accents might be useful to you analyze this. Speaking or writing in all active languages. Active languages are the languages into which you work. But you would have to do it in particular context where you need to verbalize very rigorously. You need to impose to yourself the discipline of saying exactly something that is written down or something that somebody else said, not something approximate, so as to get the discipline of producing high quality speech. And interpreting practice, which is 100% relevant, of course, because when you practice interpreting, you do exactly what you're supposed to do later. How to make it happen also, the methods and the tactics, preparation methods. Okay, we know about these. Now, glossaries, physical management of documents. This afternoon, I was talking to someone who was looking at how people are going to shape their working space with new technology. Yes, physical management of documents is part of the preparation, etc. Tactics, I talk about tactics as decisions that you have to take and action that you have to take to deal with a problem that is there, as opposed to strategies, which are decisions that need to be taken with some planning. Not quite the same thing. So some tactics save time, chunking. We have, again, one of the PhD students is interested in chunking. Chunking is cutting the flow of information into pieces so that you can process them, because if you don't, then maybe your working memory is saturated. omitting members in the long list if they're just an illustration and they're not so important. All of these tactics where you see what you lose and what you gain depending on how you deal with the problems. And there are a few references for those of you who might be interested in further questions. So I think I'll stop here. You've been very patient. And I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Gile, and a lot of insights provided, and we can't help thinking about the very practice of interpreting and many other things at the same time. So now the floor is open for questions. So we are going to switch to Zoom participants a little bit later, but do we have any questions on site?
So I'm quite interested in the later part of you mentioned the long-term memory and the short-term, the working memory. So based on the cognitive psychology part, they also mentioned the short-term memory and the working memory. So though there are some similarity, but indeed they are different. My understanding is that the short-term memory only can store a little chunks or maybe very short period, but without any functions for dealing of the information. But for the working memory, it does have the store the information, and then they can deal with or manipulate the information as well. So in your series, you always mention the working memory, but without any introduce about the short-term memory. So is there any reasons or any insight for it?
Okay, thank you. Yes, indeed. Short-term memory refers to storage. Working memory refers to storage and processing. The models I first thought of to explain phenomena that I could observe, I didn't use this cognitive psychology model of working memory. I just used a functional idea that people could identify with. I think every interpreter with no theoretical background knows that he or she sometimes have to keep some information for a short while before being able to reproduce it or to analyze it or something like that. So in the models, which are just a sort of, let's say, of a set of tools to guide one's reflection and one's analysis, I didn't refer to working memory. But if you look at things more closely, which I have done later, you find that working memory is part of comprehension, as I just showed. It is part of production, of course, and it is also part of the short-term memory effort. So these are two different ways of looking at things. There's the functional way, so it's to guide you into analyzing phenomena, and then you want to look at things technically, every one of these efforts, then you look at working memory with a processor. And then you find out that probably processes and brain activity, brain areas that deal with working memory and its operation in production, in management, in everything, are linked in a very complex way. But this is something that needs to be explored.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Good evening. Yes, I would like to ask that you have mentioned the working memory and the long-term memory during the work. I would like to ask, for example, in real life, when we do conference interpreting, we often get influenced and not by the source language only, but also by our emotions, or because it's a very high pressure environment, I would like to know whether our emotional state may impact our long-term memory or working memory as well.
Okay, it's a very interesting question, a very good question. I found some literature on that recently. I'm introducing this into some text that I'm writing maybe one of these days. It seems that stress and emotional concerns take some space in working memory. So obviously, if they take some space in working memory, there is less space for other things. So they reduce our performance. And this is why I tend to tell my students of conference interpreting, don't worry about how well you're doing in high pressure situations. Just focus on the task.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the advice.
But you'll find references in the literature. Look at emotions and cognitive efficiency, or working memory and emotions. You'll find literature quite easily.
Good evening. I have a question about the phrase flawless performance you mentioned in the beginning. I'm a bit confused because normally as the students in interpreting, we were often told that we can never be perfect or even flawless in our simultaneous interpreting. And we were often told that as long as 70% of the source language is delivered, we are quite good. So my question is, can you further elaborate on your definition of flawless performance? For example, in terms of a quantitative way, how the percentage, for example, in terms of the accuracy, completeness, and if the flawless performance in simultaneous is our target, there are any suggestions you can offer for us beginners? Thank you.
I don't know whether our teachers, when I was trained, really thought that we could provide flawless performance. I don't know whether they thought that. This was the ideal. They said so, and I believed so. So when I graduated and I passed the exam, I thought, oh, I'm a fraud. I'm not good enough, and yet they gave me the degree. And then I realized it's not so. But I think the idea is that you have, in those, let's say, in the 1970s, there was a very elitist view of conference interpreting. And they really wanted people to be excellent. They would never let people pass with 70% of the information. That's not good enough. But there are certain things, when you look at the literature, when you look at certain problem triggers like numbers, like names, you find that, for instance, for numbers, very often the accuracy rate is 80% or 90% or even below that. But for general ideas, it's higher. It all depends where you set your sights. And I think this was too stressful, the way I was taught interpreting. So I think that when, at the time of the graduation exam, they were more realistic about it. So I wouldn't take it, as a description of a realistic goal. I've worked with many people who have an excellent reputation, and I looked at their output, and I realized that they made mistakes as well, errors and omissions and all that. 70% is too low, but they do make some.
You heartbreaking. I have a question from Yuxiang over there.
Thank you, Professor Gile. So when you described simultaneous interpreting as comprehension and production happening at the same time, rather than alternating between one another, a directly irrelevant issue to this is whether it is a direct and memory-based search in the mental lexicon for target text items, or is it something that rather happens at a conceptual level, right? Is it purely linguistic or is it conceptual?
No, I don't think it's purely linguistic. It's certainly not purely linguistic. But the claim of Seleskovich and others that it is purely conceptual is obviously mistaken. True. But there's a balance between the two. I think that in simple ideas, in simple situations, it could be mostly conceptual and not linguistic. In other cases, it could be much more linguistic. When you have a child in familiar situations who translates for the parents, in very simple situations, I think it can be very conceptual. There's nothing linguistic about that. The child recognizes situations and the parents will or wish to buy or to repair or to say hello to this or that, and they just say it spontaneously in the other language. So there must be very little linguistic search for equivalence. But when we speak under pressure in a very technical meeting, then I think it probably helps to have these trans-linguistic correspondences.
Right. So, should I understand it in a way that you would believe that both would exist in simultaneous interpreting, but more linguistic, or more of a horizontal process, so to speak?
I think it's very useful. Let's say, I'll put it this way: it's very useful to teach something that is conceptual through consecutive. Because in consecutive, the words of the source speech have disappeared. You have some notes, but the words have disappeared. So it becomes much more conceptual, and this forces you to analyze what you heard. Because if you didn't analyze what you heard, then you will not remember them. There are lots of students who write down words, but they haven't done any analysis. So even though they have all the words on paper or something that corresponds to words, they are incapable of reproducing. It doesn't make sense. So in this respect, I think it is good to talk about conceptual reformulation. But if you're under high pressure, because both understanding and production are difficult, then I think it can become more linguistic. That's it's pretty clear to me. The question is, what happens to the linguistic quality of the output, and to what extent can you move away from something that is linguistic?
Right. Yeah, thank you. So my question is, what it is, in your opinion, that triggers this switch from a more linguistic process to more of a conceptual mediation?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think only research can try to answer that. Perhaps familiarity with the topic and with the language, with the two languages, would plus the idea or an ideology that it should be conceptual will trigger more conceptual or so-called vertical translation. And cognitive pressure will probably trigger something that is more with, because then you move away from what you think is right. But if what you have learned, and it seems that in China, in some cases, people are taught the linguistic way, that the linguistic way is the right one, then you don't navigate by the rule of conceptual translation, you navigate by the rule of linguistic translation. So there is a basic engine, what you think is right, and then what you can do against what you think is ideal.
Thank you.
I would like to ask a question from a trainer's perspective. And when you mentioned that in training interpreters in particular, we give them like breakdowns, training them on listening and then speaking. separately, and then we incorporate them into one act, the practicing of interpreting itself. I'm thinking about my own practice of tennis recently, because the tennis trainer will teach me different moves, and then I got bored to a certain extent, although I couldn't manage to the perfect level, say for example, a single move. But sometimes if he asked me to practice tennis, just like we were competing with each other, I feel that I'm more at ease, and sometimes I can get the move in the flow, so the flow state. So from your experience, when is the right moment to introduce the entire set of interpreting instead of practicing on individual elements like listening and speaking and interpreting? Thank you.
We don't practice these individual this class. We don't do that. I think we always do interpreting exercises, but starting with just listening and retelling without notes, just to exercise one's analytical ability, just for a short while, and then we move into consecutive without notes, and then we move. And after a year, it's never speaking or listening individually. What I'm referring to is what you should do at home, what students should do at home if they feel that, or even if they don't feel so, but so as to improve their passive and active knowledge of languages.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's switch to online participants to see whether we have any questions from Zoom. So if you have a question, you can either show your face and then ask directly, or you can type your questions in the chat box and let us know what questions you have. While we're waiting, another question. We read recently some scholars writing about especially the difference in between what we may call multitasking in simultaneous interpreting and microtasking, which is about fulfilling one task after another in the process of interpreting. So it is said that actually in simultaneous interpreting, there's no real multitasking, but more like microtasking. I wonder what's your take on that? Thank you.
I don't know enough. I'm aware of the issue. I'm waiting for further research to shed some light on that.
Thank you. We lost the sound. Do we have any questions from Zoom? A lot of thank yous.
Hi, Professor Gile. Okay, so thank you very much for taking my question, and thank you to our host. So I was wondering, given the emergence of AI interpreters, do you feel that the AI simultaneous interpreters also kind of follow your effort model? Okay, so that's the first question. A second question is like the AIGC contents. What kind of roles do you think they play in facilitating simultaneous interpreters during their preparation? Okay, so thank you for the questions, and thank you to our interpreter.
Did you get it? Did you explain to me? No, it's fine. Okay, we're just developing AI right now. We're trying to see what the advantages and what the drawbacks are. The effort models, again, the effort models are not something that is all powerful. They're just a way of looking at things. I would use the effort models just so as to orient me towards seeing what type of distinct elements of cognitive load or cognitive relief come in through AI. It's tools like terminology, like glossaries, like things like that, And then you have more global tools like automatic speech recognition. The question is, what happens with them? If they provide visual input, then when people look at them, does it relieve their load? Does it add interference? Does it speed up things? Does it cause more interference in this way or that way? I think research will tell us, but it's very difficult to predict. I don't believe in full AI interpreting for our purposes. It can happen in controlled situations, definitely, but in complex situations, especially those situations where you need to be sensitive to people's human reactions, affective reactions. Can you see AI interpreting done in real life, sign language interpreting in contacts between public services and deaf people who are, who are seeking solutions for difficult problems? I'm not sure that AI will be sensitive enough, will be able to understand what the clients really want, what the clients really get from the interpretation. So I don't see this as replacing interpreters.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we do have 3 questions listed here already. Professor Gile, could you please further can we finish the question from Siqi first? And then when we finish the 3 questions on the screen, then we can allow people to ask questions directly through the camera and mic. Okay, so
dependency distance.
Yeah.
Yes, dependency distance is something very interesting that I didn't know about. I discovered it reading some Chinese papers. So thanks for the contribution of Chinese cognitive linguists and other linguists to research on interpreting. In a sentence, you have words that depend or do not depend on each other. And the distance is roughly measured by the number of words between 2 words that are in a relation between. Like if I say, well, I can't give you an example, but think of a sentence and think how long you have to wait and keep one word in memory until it makes sense. In some cases, you need to keep 3 or 4 or 5 words because you don't understand the first word until you heard the 4th. And in some cases, not just in terms of words, but in terms of the sentence, of what the sentence says. And in some cases, it's a very short distance. There are no words in between. So this is dependency distance. Dependency distance is an indication of syntactic complexity. And to me, it's actually an indicator of cognitive load. There is obviously higher informational cognitive load if dependency distance is large than if dependency distance is small. And what these Chinese, I don't remember all the names, so I would like to quote one without all of them. What they have found, for instance, is that in interpreting, the dependency distance tends to be smaller than in spontaneous speech, probably because there are so many things that are done roughly at the same time, which puts a heavier cognitive pressure on the interpreters, and they need to.
And then we have another question from Sophie Lam. How do you explain the mental and the vocal exhaustion after interpreting? Advice on how to limit this fatigue.
I only have common sense explanations. You devote a lot of effort, and after a lot of effort, you're tired. That's all. Anybody else has more scientific or more insightful explanations? I'll be happy to hear.
I'm not sure whether the motivation can come into play. You just mentioned motivation, and I'm thinking about a case in Hong Kong when I'm not sure whether you found that, especially when you take a taxi, there will be at least at least 3 or even more screens in front of the taxi driver. And they usually, because in Hong Kong, instead of just the Uber, they use a lot of apps. So I always find they are seamlessly switching between apps and then driving at the same time and talking to their peers on the phone. I didn't know how to do it, but maybe motivation like the drive or the immediate access to earning money from getting a job can be, I don't know. They don't seem to
train interpreters will to have them drive taxis for a few years. Then they get the cognitive skills, and afterwards they only learn the languages, and that's it.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that can be introduced into interpreter training, maybe driver taxi. We do have other questions. Liu Na says, thank you for sharing. I'm just reading for the interpreter's sake. What do you think of the melody and rhythm effects related to working memory? Do you think prosodic shadowing and the content shadowing will help to deal with the cognitive challenges, especially in language acquisition? Thank you.
Yes, I think so. I think these are further indications that will help memory identify, that help the indications for working memory more to establish networks.
Another question from Siqi. I'd like to ask about a phenomenon observed in translated English, especially the higher frequency of using that as the connective. Research suggests this could be a part of a broader tendency towards grammatical explicitness in translation and might also be linked to the cognitive complexity involved in the translation process. Most studies on this topic are based on written translation corpora. Have you observed similar patterns in interpreted English? A lot of questions. Do you think this phenomena could be related to the cognitive processes of interpreters more broadly? How do you view the cognitive differences between interpreting and the written translation in this context? Sorry, Jessica, long question.
You see what she does? She had to look at it. She had to look. Did you look at the she had to look, then she had to wait, then she had to go and interpret it for deaf people. So that relies on working memory and on long-term memory and positioning in space and working memory saturated. And by the time she gets home, she'll be exhausted. Yes, I think it definitely is something that is linked to cognitive processes, but I don't know in what way. It could be that people are trying to analyze the source language, and because they analyze the source language in terms of logical links between the various parts, they put markers that show what chunks of information are there and how they relate to each other. And it could be a marker, unconscious, some kind of strategy, so that they know that they have finished with one idea and the link between that idea and another idea that comes afterwards. So the link between causes, that marks connections explicitly. Now, this may happen in translation as well, but I would say that in translation, when that happens, it's probably because people, or possibly because translators want the text to be clear to readers, and they want to be more explicit in the connectives.
Okay, because of the time limit, and we don't want Kat and Jessica, the two sign language interpreters today, to end up in pure fatigue after today's session, we will only allow 2 questions. So in order to be fair to all, I'm going to read one question, the immediate one, following the long question of Siqi, and then another question. I think we see people raising hands. So I'm going to do random sampling. Maybe we can ask Shadow Sam to announce your question after I read this one. So the next question is the opinion about reflective practice in interpreter training. How come little to no attention is given to this practice, seeing as it is very effective in other expertise-dependent professions? Professor Gile, please.
Reflective, that takes a lot of time. So the question is, if you devote a lot of time to reflection, how much time do you have for practice? And which is more efficient? So maybe reflective would help us gain time, but maybe it will not be as efficient as just practice, plus guided practice with teachers telling you what's right, what's wrong, and how you should do this or that. So I don't have an answer. I think we could experiment with that, but it's a bit difficult.
Thank you.
Practical terms, resources.
Thank you very much. Now, Shadow San, would you like to ask your question in person?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you, Professor Gile, for your presentation. I want to ask a question about cognitive load, because we know that the cognitive load can be dynamic in real events of interpretation. For example, interpreters may have their own expectations of knowledge used for when interpreting assignment. So they prepared documents, and after that, the real event could turn out to be more demanding for the knowledge. So the cognitive load can be dynamic in real interpreting events, and it can increase in this event. So has this case ever happened to you in your career, and what is your reaction? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand what kind of cognitive load you're referring to. Is it something that in literature are called as mental load, which includes cognitive load in terms of cognitive pressure, but also feelings of frustration, fatigue, etc., etc.? Or are you talking about cognitive load? In other words, let's say, the ability of the brain to do certain operations versus the requirements? What do you mean exactly by cognitive load?
I mean, there can be a mismatch between our expectation of knowledge used in interpreting event, but later when interpreters interpret in the assignment, more knowledge can be required for this event. So this kind of mismatch may increase their cognitive load. So am I clear?
Yeah, well, I think it increases their cognitive load, probably, but it also increases their frustration and their dissatisfaction and maybe stress. To me, cognitive load is very specific. Actually, I have been trying to work on that, and I have proposed to define what I call informational cognitive load. In other words, cognitive load is measured by the number of chunks that are in working memory at a certain time, and then see what happens with a certain cognitive load. So the values of the variable cognitive load would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably not more than 6 or 7. And then you see with a certain cognitive load, what happens? Are the interpreters able to function? Does their effort increase or does it not increase? Does the frustration increase? What kind of activity goes on in the brain? This is what I would call cognitive load in cognitive terms for further cognitive exploration of interpreting. But you're talking about something that is much more general. And I don't really know what to tell you that you wouldn't know anyway.
Okay. But still, thank you.
Since we still have 2 minutes and we have Xu Piao really wanted to get an answer to the question eagerly. I'm breaking my own rule here. So one final question. She would like to ask, or he would like to ask, whether there is a necessity to practice accented English source material to help us better deal with the pressure things the AI, again, AI translation, machines can do the standard English accent in consecutive interpreting.
So I suppose you mean in the source language. Yes, definitely. You need to find all sorts of accents. Obviously, you need to practice when you're a sign language interpreter with all sorts of signers, with all the variations in sign language. Otherwise, it is more difficult to understand what they're saying. You need to have more information in working memory, more networks. Accents are definitely part of it, because nowadays in meetings, in conferences, most speakers are not native English speakers. And even if they are native, American or English or Australian or African English, you need to practice with accented English definitely. And if AI does not produce accented English, then AI needs to be taught how to speak English, flawed English, fast English, colloquial English, all of that, to simulate all sorts of human aspects. Otherwise, you only learn the basics with AI, and that's not enough.
Thanks a lot, Professor Gile. We really appreciate your insight for sharing, especially from a combined perspective of a wonderful researcher, trainer, and practitioner. We learned a lot from the talk. And we also want to give special thanks to the two interpreters today from Brand. Yes? I'm afraid there's no time for more questions. Thank you. So we want to thank our sign language interpreters, Kat and Jessica from Brandwood. They have been working really, really hard. So thank you very much. And we hope that you can continue thinking about the kind of cognitive efforts relating to interpreting and continue practicing interpreting in particular. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.